Today's lecture is on attitudes, the final lecture of the course. Just to give you a roadmap for what we'll be covering today on attitudes. First, we'll talk about some definitions. What exactly is an attitude? We'll talk about classic definitions, some of the original definitions from 100 years ago, and we'll talk about modern definitions of attitudes. How do you measure attitudes? How do you know what someone's attitude is like? There are common methods that you're probably familiar with, that you've actually experienced, methods like surveys, political polls, someone just asking you, rate this person you met, right? Rate them from 0 to 10, right? Just in casual conversation. So this way of measuring attitudes, or the ways of measuring attitudes, are something you've been exposed to already in the past. Okay, why do we have attitudes? What do they do for us? This is what we will cover under the functions of attitudes. Do they actually predict behavior, right? Someone can ask you in a poll or a survey or a questionnaire, how do you feel about something? Do you feel that person, that product that they're marketing, policy, a political policy, is it good or is it bad? Okay, and just because you think something's good or bad, maybe it does not predict your actual behavior towards that policy, person, whatever the object of your attitude is, right? But maybe sometimes it does. So there's also the question that we'll cover today. When do attitudes predict behavior? Okay, what kinds of persuasive messages work? That is, how do we change attitudes? Is there some messages where we can include positive images? Will that have an impact? Is it more likely that if you have the best arguments, statistics, facts, logical arguments, that will work to change someone's attitudes? What makes for a good persuasive message under what circumstances? So we'll also be covering that today. And lastly, if we can change someone's attitude, is it possible to go in the reverse direction? Can we change someone's behavior, and will that in turn lead to a change in their attitude about whatever it is they're behaving towards, right? Like maybe a group, right? Maybe a group initiates you by having you do a series of rituals. Maybe that ends up impacting your attitudes to be more positive, right? Maybe you have to make a quick choice, right? You haven't thought about it much. You have to make a choice at the grocery market. You didn't know you'd have to make that choice. And then after the fact, right? After you've chosen one thing over another, you have to reconcile, right? Reconcile with the fact that you chose, with that item, right? One item over another. Maybe that changes your attitude in a more positive direction, right? Maybe you have to justify why you chose that item over the other item. Okay. So we're going to cover all these different aspects of attitudes. Okay, let's start off with definitions. Okay, originally, the word attitude was not a psychological construct. It didn't have any psychological meaning. It was originally used to indicate direction. Okay, for example, the position of a body, figure, or statue. Okay, if it is, at an upward angle, it has an upward attitude. Okay, if it has a downward angle, right, we would say it has a downward attitude. Okay, and similar in some respects to the word altitude, which you may be more familiar with as a term, right, as a word that's used for direction, especially in case of altitude. We're talking about direction in the air. Okay, usually used for airplanes, jets. Okay, and the word attitude is still used in aeronautics. Okay, it usually means or it refers to the orientation of the aircraft relative to the horizon. Okay, so again, originally the term attitude had a very physical meaning, not psychological. Okay, meaning stance, position, the direction. Okay, that something, an object is towards something else. That word towards is the operative meaning, definition, meaning the attitude must always be towards something or away from something. Okay, it has originally a very directional meaning. Okay, and so that idea, okay, that attitudes are towards something or away from something, that it has something to do with the physical direction, that had a impact, okay, obviously on the original words or the original definitions used for attitude, the original understandings, okay, of what the word meant. And if you look at these very early definitions, the word attitude really only started being used by psychologists in the 1920s. Gordon Allport, his definition was used for a very long time in the 20th century. His definition is a mental state of readiness, exerting a directive. Okay, there's that directional idea again, exerting a directive influence upon an individual's response to an object and all situations with which that object is related. Okay, so again, there's a directional influence. So we're either moving towards an object or away from it. Okay, this is very behavioral, right? Because now we're talking about an organism, right? Humans, and they behave, right? Moving towards, approaching objects. Often we think that indicates favorability, right? That you think the object is worthy of your attention, that it's good to move towards, to approach, right? It's attractive maybe. Whereas you avoid, right, move away from an object, it means that it must be bad, maybe threatening, disgusting, smelly. It's bad in some way, right? And so the organism, the human, other animals, right, when they move away from objects, what we call avoidance behavior, it usually indicates disfavorability, right? They do not like the object. And so behavior is a good indication of whether or not you like something. Okay, Carl Jung's definition, also very behavioral, readiness of the mind to act, right? Action is a key word here in his definition, or react, right? Reaction in a certain way. So again, all these definitions are very behavioral. They're emphasizing actual movement towards or away from an object, and that indicates, right, whether or not you like or dislike the object. Okay. On to a more modern definition. Okay, Alice Eagley provided this definition in 1993. It's now the dominant definition amongst social psychologists, other people, other scholars who study attitudes. Okay, and she calls, or she defines attitude as a psychological tendency. Okay, psychological tendency, so very psychological now. Okay, not an emphasis on direction or action. Okay, and it is expressed. Okay, that is, we know what the tendency is. Okay, by a person's evaluation of a particular entity. Okay, that could be an object or a person. Okay, and their evaluation of the entity indicates some degree of favor or disfavor. Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit. First of all, there's a psychological tendency. Okay, so what we're saying there is it's not absolute, right? Your attitude could shift. Okay, so mostly it could be mostly good or mostly bad. Okay, if it's mostly good, then most of the time we should see expressions of goodness. Okay, that you're using maybe your beliefs, right? Your words, your statements. Could be your facial expressions, right? Happiness, if you're showing expressions of happiness, right? It could also be your behavior, right? You're moving towards an attractive, likable object or person, okay? So what we see here, right, is that no longer is our social psychologists emphasizing a behavior moving towards or away from the object. Now we see behavior is just one kind of expression, okay, one kind of indication of whether you think an object's good or bad, but there are other indicators, okay, of that evaluation. For example, there could be what we call cognition. Cognition is the thoughts, beliefs you have in your head, usually indicated through the statements that you're using, right? That's not behavior, okay? So if you say, I like her, okay, or I like Pepsi, right, or I think that policy is a good idea, those are cognitions, right, thoughts that indicate that you have a positive evaluation of some object or person or idea. Okay, affect, emotions, that could be expressed through nonverbal behaviors. It could be expressed through words, or it could be expressed privately. We may not know what your true feelings or emotions are on a particular topic, right? So that may be observable, but may not be sometimes. Behavior, this is obviously moving towards or away from the object, indicates evaluation, but it's not the sole indicator of the attitude. There are these other components, right? Emotions and thoughts. So all three of those can be used to infer, okay, what a person's evaluation is, how much they favor or disfavor some object, person, or idea. Okay, so just to review that again, these components of evaluation, they can be emotional or also what we call affect. Okay, they could be behavior, okay, or they could be thoughts, okay, usually indicated by statements that you're making about the object, person, or idea. Okay, so just some examples here. And we also call this the ABCs of evaluation, okay, to remind us that there's 3 different ways in which you can infer what a person's attitude actually is. Okay, so again, it could be affective or emotional reactions. For example, if you see a particular car and you uh, associate the car with being sporty, okay, that's going to produce positive emotions, okay, towards the car, okay. On the other hand, right, if you associate the car with foreign manufacturers, right, and you feel that's just bad, then it can cause you to just have negative feelings towards the car. Okay, it might actually be manufactured in the U.S., create U.S. jobs, but just that association, okay, has an emotional, affective association, right, negative, and that just leads to the emotional reaction. Okay, it could just be the beliefs you have. If you just think that the car has bad specs, that it is unreliable, okay, maybe it doesn't have a good fuel efficiency, those very logical, matter-of-fact attributes of the car, those are usually what we think of as cognitive reactions, beliefs you have towards the object. Okay, behavior. Okay, well, again, this would be indicated by whether you approach or avoid the object. If you go to the dealership, you test drive the car, you actually buy the car, that's a good indicator that you have a positive attitude towards that particular kind of car. Okay, so those are, again, the three different ways in which we can determine, infer the kind of attitude you have towards an object. Okay, and the attitude is psychological. It is in your head. That's not something that we can see, but we have these three different ways of being able to infer what that attitude is inside of people's heads. So how do we actually measure this, right? We are psychologists, scientists, so we like to quantify attitudes. We don't just ask someone, what is your attitude on something, in an open-ended way, okay? Because we like to make quantitative relationships. We like to be able to use quantitative information to predict other things like behavior, okay, or maybe other attitudes. Okay, and so quantifying attitudes has been something that psychologists have pursued, been interested in since the 1920s. Okay, and the first attempt in the 1920s comes from Thurstone. What Thurstone did in order to try and quantify people's attitudes, how much they were in favor, against, or for a particular political policy. What he did was he took statements from print media, so this means newspapers, magazines of the time, okay, and then he had people, usually other researchers, psychologists, students, give numerical weights. Okay, so how positive, using a number, right, like maybe 0 to 9, okay, on how positive or how negative each of the statements from print media, right, newspapers, magazines, how positive or negative those statements were about the policy. Okay, then he takes a group of participants. After doing all that work, right, he takes a group of participants, and then the participants' goal is to check off which statements they agree with, okay, and the numerical weights. Okay, basically all the statements you agree with that have positive numbers and all the ones that have negative numbers, they all get added together, and that is your attitude score. Okay, what is your right degree of favorability or disfavorability toward, in this case, a policy. Okay, and these scales were used a lot early on because it was what was available. Okay, but the amount of work that it took, having to go through newspapers, magazines, having to then get another set of raters to weight the statements before you could finally, give these checklists out to participants. And it was many statements that participants needed to funnel through, right, to check off whether they agreed or disagreed with the statement. So these early skills, they were cumbersome. They took a lot of work and effort just to produce these attitude scores. Okay, and so researchers kept looking for better ways to measure attitudes. Okay. Likert is the second attempt to come up with a way to measure attitudes in the 1930s. Now, this is a scale that you are probably very familiar with. Most surveys, questionnaires today use this type of scale. Okay, again, it's Likert is a social psychologist who developed this scale. Okay, originally, like Thurstone, he took statements from print media. Okay, but he did not have people check them off. Okay, he did not have raters prior to the participants rating the statements. There were no raters to give them weights. Instead, he gave every person a scale with the statements. Again, originally from print media, but later on, researchers made their own statements. Okay, so the researchers today mostly construct their own questions on their surveys. They don't use statements from print media these days. Okay, and this scale is one that you're probably familiar with. The participant is asked for each statement how strongly you disagree or agree, okay, with the statement. Okay, And then the ratings that you give, right? It could be 0 to 5. Maybe it's a longer scale of 0 to 6, maybe. And in that case, right, all of your ratings that you provided get added up, and that's your attitude score, right? How much you favor, disfavor this particular person, object, or idea. In the 1950s, Osgood came up with yet another method for measuring attitudes. In this case, there's no verbal labels. Okay, with the Likert scale, you have to have all these levels of agreement or disagreement. With the semantic differential, all you have are two terms, okay, on either side of the scale. Okay, just two verbal terms. Okay, and there's just a numerical scale. Okay, it's up to the participant to envision the scale representing how good or bad, okay, or maybe how unattractive or unattractive. With a semantic differential, you can change up the terms that you can substitute terms for good or bad, such that you can use attractiveness or unattractiveness, strong versus weak. It allows you to use a variety of evaluative terms, okay, not just good or bad or disagree or agree. So that's one of the advantages of this scale. It also allows you to use more numbers because the numbers don't have verbal weights. You don't have to keep coming up with new verbal labels for each of the numbers. Instead, the participant can just imagine in their own mind, right, what each, this being a continuum, okay, meaning that it is the full range of strongness or weakness, attractiveness, unattractiveness, goodness, badness, of that dimension, that property of this object, right? So if we're talking about healthcare policy, right, you think it's a good or bad? Do you think that it is effective or ineffective? You can have a scale for each of those semantics, okay, those evaluative terms, and the scale doesn't need, right, to have all these verbal definitions. You can just imagine the numbers on this scale as being the full range, okay, of where you can go, effectiveness and ineffectiveness, or maybe goodness or badness for that policy. Okay. Another way in which attitudes have been measured recently is through what's called a feeling thermometer. In this case, the participant are shown a thermometer. If it's done on computer, if it's done on telephone, you are asked to imagine a thermometer. In either case, you're told that the thermometer has a 0 label at the bottom, a 100 label at the top, 50 in the middle, and that 0 represents absolute coldness. Okay, no feelings of warmness at all towards a person, a group, an idea, and 100 represents complete and absolute warmness, closeness to the person, group, idea, other kind of object, and 50 being a neutral point, okay, where you don't feel too hot or too cold towards the object. Okay, and this has been an effective way to get more at the emotional or affective expression of attitudes. Okay, because it gets rid of all beliefs, all behaviors, and gets more towards the intuitive feeling, emotion that people have towards a particular person, group, or idea. Okay. So those are different ways that attitudes have been measured in the past. These days, the Likert scale, semantic differential, and feeling thermometers are the dominant ways, methods for how to measure attitudes today. All right, so let's talk about when attitudes predict, or let's start off with where attitudes come from. Why do we have attitudes? And this leads us to understanding the functions of attitudes. Okay, functions meaning what do they do for us? How do attitudes serve us? And there's 4 main functions that social psychologists have identified. First is if we're talking about functions, the utilitarian function is going to be the most functional, right? Because we're talking about how useful, how functional the object or maybe person or idea is for me. What does it do for me, right? So sometimes people only consider political policies like taxation policy because somehow it impacts them. Okay, and so the idea is, does it benefit me? Does it not benefit me? Okay, and we usually call that pocketbook politics because it's the usefulness of the policy in terms of your finances, right? Financial gain or loss of how you are looking at the policy. Okay, it's very similar also to the social exchange theory of relationships, right? That people choose to be in relationships, romantic, business, because somehow it benefits them, somehow they get something out of it. And so this would be the same viewpoint, but for attitudes, okay, attitudes towards anything, okay, not just relationship partners, business partners, but also policy ideas, products, okay, products that someone might market at the grocery store or other retail stores. Okay. The next function is ego defensive. Okay, you're familiar with some of these functions. So, for example, if someone feels bad, right, and they use downward social comparisons, that is, they use prejudice or a negative evaluation towards a group that's disadvantaged, right, in order to feel better about themselves, to protect their ego, to boost their own ego. That's ego defensiveness. Okay, or if someone crosses a red light and they say to themselves, everyone does it, right? In order to feel better about themselves, right? To have more a casual, indifferent attitude towards crossing red lights, not taking it seriously. Why are they doing that? Because they're trying to protect themselves. They don't want to think of themselves as a bad or terrible person, right? When someone says, oh, I can't do this presentation tomorrow, right? I can't do this presentation tomorrow because I stayed up all night worrying about the stock market crashing. Okay. Remember, self-handicapping is when you do something, right, so that you have an excuse later, right, to protect your ego, to protect yourself from fear of failure. So if your presentation fails, right, or you're unable to do your presentation, you have an excuse, right? But maybe you don't care about the stock market. Just in this case, having the positive attitude towards it, being anxious about it, concerned, led to you being able to protect your ego, right, from failure later. Okay. And there's many other kinds of strategies people can use to protect their sense of self, to maintain self-esteem, and this is a driver, okay, of main function for some attitudes. Okay, the knowledge function is very simple. Okay, your past experiences make up your knowledge, okay, of the person, idea, object. And if you have mostly good experiences, like, for example, with the intergroup contact hypothesis, if you have a lot of good experiences with out-group members of other groups, then you're more likely to have a positive attitude, right? If you've had negative experiences, right, negative contact with other groups, then you're more likely to have a negative attitude towards them. Okay. Value expressive function is mostly a result of ideas that you have, right? Ideas that may come from political ideology. Okay, so if you are more liberal or progressive, you may have internalized the idea that you are supposed to be progressive, egalitarian, that is, promote equality amongst different races, different religions, the different genders, different sexualities. And so you might have a more positive attitude towards, say, the LGBT community, women in positions of power, African Americans, other ethnic minorities. On the other hand, it might be that your religion or your culture teaches you to not like other groups, right? You may be raised in a fundamentalist household. Maybe it's Jewish, right? And you have a negative attitudes towards maybe Muslims, okay? Or vice versa. Maybe you're in a fundamentalist Islam home, right? And you may have negative attitudes towards Jews and Christians. And fundamentalist Christianity, of course, is associated with anti-Semitism, Islamophobia as well. So it can go in either direction, right? Depending on the culture, values, ideologies that you have, that you've internalized, that you've been exposed to, those will also have an impact, influence on your attitudes. Okay, so a variety of different places where your attitude can originate from. Okay, and there's many other functions that aren't here, but these are the four main functions that social psychologists have studied in surveys and in the laboratory. Okay, so let's move on to not just why do we have attitudes, measuring attitudes, but when are they predictive of actual behavior. So the reason why there's a question about whether they predict behavior is because early on in the 1930s, one psychologist named LaPierre, he toured the United States with a Chinese couple. At this time, in the United States, most white Americans had negative attitudes towards the Chinese. There were restrictions on how many Chinese immigrants could come to the United States, how long they could stay here, and there were also restrictions up until the 1960s on Chinese immigrants, Chinese Americans' ability to own their own property. Okay, so not until the 60s do we start to see a liberalizing of attitudes towards the Chinese. So definitely negative attitudes. Okay, so LaPierre figured, right, that since the attitudes are so negative in the United States, that taking this Chinese couple for a tour, he would get rejected, okay, by many hotels and restaurants during their tour of the United States. Okay, but in actuality, most establishments provided service, okay, to the Chinese couple. Okay, although LaPierre did ask them, okay, in a letter, how many of the institutions would accept Chinese people as guests. Okay, only 8%. Okay, 92% said no, no way. We don't admit Chinese to our restaurant. Only 8% said yes. But remember, most actually admitted, right? They provided service, the hotels and restaurants, to this Chinese couple. So there seems to be a disconnect, right? There's a disconnect between behavior and attitudes in the situation. Okay, so you go beyond LaPierre's study, many other studies are done, and then by the 1960s, okay, Wicker does a review of all these studies that have been done over the last 30 years, and what he finds is that it seems most of these studies show that attitudes don't predict behavior. Okay, he found correlations below 0.3. Okay, if you remember about correlations, a 0 correlation means no relationship. A correlation of 1 means a very strong relationship. So we're headed in the 0 direction here, right? 0.3 is getting closer to 0. So sometimes, right, very few times, It seems that they're predictive, but most of the time not, okay? At least according to these studies. And so this puts all the idea of, the success of being able to measure attitudes, right? Figure out their origins. Maybe all of that doesn't matter, because if they don't predict behavior, then what is the use of measuring attitudes at all, right? Behavior is what actually shapes the world, right? Shapes our relationships with each other. And so, just finding out favorability on a questionnaire or survey that's disconnected from all that behavior that has actual real impact, right? It might mean that it's all meaningless, okay? That it's meaningless to measure attitudes, okay? And so this obviously prompted, incentivized as many social psychologists to try and rescue, to save attitudes, to find a way to make them meaningful. And so one of the first people, or one of the first theories to try and refine how attitudes were measured so that they would be better predictors of behavior, is the theory of reasoned action. Okay, so they throw away the whole idea of even measuring attitudes as we traditionally define it, right? Asking all those series of questions or giving statements from print media. And instead, they use what is called behavioral intention. Okay, now this is a very specific statement about a very specific behavior done at a specific time. In fact, I use that word specific 3 times because specificity is the main goal, okay, when you measure behavioral intentions. So again, we're talking about a specific behavior, okay, done at a specific time. Okay, so the traditional attitude question would be something like, how favorable are you towards the birth control pill, right? You got your object of evaluation, the birth control pill, and you're asking, what's the positivity towards that? Well, these are the kinds of questions that don't predict behavior well. Okay, so the theory of reasoned action says that you ask a specific behavior done at a specific time. So instead you ask, how likely are you to remember to take, right? We're going back to action now, to behavior. How likely are you to remember to take your birth control pill at the same time each day for the next month? Okay, that's using that principle of specificity. If you want to predict this very specific behavior that happens at these very specific times, then you ask about that very specific behavior done at these specific times. You're more likely to predict the behavior. Okay, makes a lot of sense. Okay, other things that the researchers in this tradition do in the theory of reasoned action is they have participants list beliefs or thoughts about the behavior, and then the researcher takes these beliefs and assigns them a negative or positive value. Okay, the participant also lists subjective norms. What does this mean? They mean the expectations that significant others in their life, maybe parents, romantic partners, pastors, teachers, friends, anyone who they listen to and think of as important in their life. They list the expectations of those people. Those are what we call norms. In this case, they're subjective norms because they're what you think. Okay, those other people expect of you, as opposed to an objective norm, right? One that we can see and measure outside of people, right? These are subjective norms, what you think significant people in your life expect of you in terms of this behavior. Okay. And the experimenter assigns negative or positive values for each of those. Okay, and then what is usually found is that if overall, okay, your beliefs, thoughts about the behavior, the subjective norms about the behavior, if those are in the more positive direction, usually it means that you had a more positive behavioral intention. If those are ranging in the negative direction, usually means your behavioral intention is more negative. Okay, so as you can see, in order to predict behavior, the measurement of attitudes needs to be more behavioral. Okay, we're talking about your intention to perform the behavior and your beliefs and subjective norms about the behavior. There's a third aspect to it added by this other theory called theory of planned behavior. Theory of planned behavior is exactly like theory of reasoned action, except it adds one more component, okay, one more factor that's called controllability, or sometimes perceived controllability. Okay, so the reason this came about is because sometimes whether we can perform a behavior is outside of our hands. Okay, we may have the intention, the desire, motivation to perform the behavior, but we simply cannot do it. Okay, and so this other idea of perceived behavioral control was added to the model because it improves the prediction of behavior. Okay, and basically this came about because in the past researchers found that when participants reported that they had little control over their behavior. Okay, this is very similar to an external locus of control, meaning that, oh, I can't control anything that happens to me. What does this mean? Well, you may want to do stuff, desire to do specific behaviors at specific times, but because you believe you don't have control over your life, it doesn't end up happening. Okay, whereas for other people who have more of an internal locus of control, they believe they have control over their lives. When they have an intention to do something specific at a specific time, it's more likely to happen. Okay, so let's go over an example. Okay, because these models are specific to predicting behavior. A lot of times they are used for health behavior. Okay, making sure that people take their diabetes medication, taking their insulin shots. People with tuberculosis are doing their treatments at the exact same time. Also, women who are using birth control. You have to use it at the same time each day, or it's not going to be effective. Okay. So let's go over an example. This will be using birth control pills. How would these researchers go about asking women about their intention to use the pill? Okay. So first, you want to measure beliefs about the behavior. Okay. In this case, right, what do you know about the pill? Well, it might reduce your chance of getting pregnant. How effective do you think it is at doing that? Okay, so beliefs about the behavior. Remember, the subjective norms are the expectations that you think, right, other people have about this behavior, right? So your close friends, how do they feel about the birth control pill? Okay. And remember, also locus of control, whether you think you have control over your life is also an important predictor of whether you'll actually go about carrying out the behavior. Okay, so if you think you're forgetful, okay, if you think it makes it difficult for you to do anything because you can't control your forgetfulness, then that will probably uh, it'll probably be likely that you'll not end up taking your birth control pill consistently each day. And then finally, you ask about the intention to perform the behavior, right? And here are some other ways that you could measure subjective norms and perceived behavioral control, right? Most of my friends are using birth control pills, right? Modeling, that's another way in which you might be impacted or for you to learn the norms and expectations of others, right? And yeah, how possible, how likely it is that you think you can, okay, effectively go about taking those, that birth control pill each day. And often when you follow up with actual reports of behavior, asking participants if they've performed the behaviors or not consistently, you find that the intention is a better predictor. Okay, when you have those other factors like beliefs of the behavior, subjective norms, and perceived controllability. So these classic models of attitudes, right, are all premised on a person, a human who makes what we call deliberate decisions about their behavior, right? They have thoughts about the behavior, beliefs, and then they proceed to engage in the behavior. Okay, that's what we call reasoned action or rational behavior. That is, you're acting out of beliefs, reasons that you have for liking or not liking the behavior. Okay, or you do the behavior based on planning, right? You plan to do the behavior because of the importance it has, the beliefs you have about it, the subjective norms you believe in regards to the behavior. Okay, and those are all statements that you can make. This is how the research is done when trying to predict behavior from your attitudes towards that behavior. Okay, but as we learned right in the previous section on social cognition, a lot of our behavior is what we would call thoughtless, not deliberative. It's more impulsive, spontaneous, habitual thoughts. Okay, what John Barge and other social cognition researchers call automatic. Right? Remember, he uses that word automaticity, and he makes that distinction between automatic processes, right, more impulsive, spontaneous thinking, versus controlled processes, right, where you do more thoughtful behavior, you have more deliberate thinking that precedes your behavior. Okay, and so there's these two kinds of processes, right? And so when it comes to attitudes, as you've learned with the previous section on social cognition, right, you took the implicit association test, you learned about how automatic attitudes are measured, right? These implicit attitudes, right? Using these measures where the person doesn't know, right, that you're measuring their attitudes, unlike a survey or questionnaire, right? What we call explicit methods, right? Where you know your attitude is being measured, right? There's nothing covert or secretive about it. That's why we call it explicit. To be explicit is for things to be very transparent and known to everyone. Implicit means that it's not as, it's not right in your face. Okay, it's not as transparent. Okay, it's more covert. Okay, and so a lot of the methods for measuring implicit attitudes, they go so fast it's hard to control your responses, or sometimes you don't even know that that is what is being measured, right? Like in a priming experiment. Okay. And so we know there are these different kinds of attitudes, and there are different methods that are needed for measuring the different kinds of attitudes. Okay, but that also means we need a better model, a more comprehensive model that is able to account for both reasoned, thoughtful, deliberative attitudes and those that are more impulsive and spontaneous. And that is where Russ Fazio comes into play. He developed a model in which the main factors or determinants of when you will use more deliberative, thoughtful attitudes versus spontaneous, impulsive attitudes. The main determinants are motivation and opportunity. Okay, sometimes this is also called willing and able. these two principles. So motivation and opportunity are also willing and able. Okay? And basically, it's a dual process model, very much along the lines of what John Barge and other social cognition researchers would suggest. Okay, and so the way that this model describes how attitudes occur, Russ Fazio would say that we first encounter an attitude object, right? It could be another group, an outgroup, it could be a person, policy idea, a can of soda. Okay, it doesn't matter. Okay, but that when you first encounter that object, the automatic attitude is immediately activated. Okay, and it's either in the more positive or negative direction. And as long as there is nothing else that comes to mind, okay, that is the attitude that will get expressed. Okay, your nonverbals, probably even your actual statements will reflect this immediate, intuitive, impulsive attitude that you have when exposed to the object. Okay, so this is why John Bart says, 90% of the time we're on autopilot, right? Because most of the time we do go with that gut feeling that immediately comes to mind. Okay. However, okay, features of the environment, okay, or the person, okay, can activate different motives. Okay. So for example, you may be conducting a job interview, maybe something about the person you're interviewing elicits an automatic bias or automatic attitude, maybe not during the whole interview, but at different points. Okay, but right, that information is not relevant to you making a decision about how good a candidate this person is for the position. Okay, or imagine you're, on a jury, someone's being tried for assault and battery. The case is hard to decide, and part of you is feeling biased towards the defendant for some reason or another, but you know that that's not relevant information. It's not good, right? It's not being accurate or making an objective decision if you allow that bias to affect you. Okay. And so a motive for accuracy may supersede, right, these automatic evaluations. And then if you have the opportunity, right, you're not being forced, pressure to make a decision right away, that will lead to a weakening. Okay, the impulsive attitude will weaken, and these more deliberative, thoughtful ideas you have about being objective or being accurate will supersede. Okay, they will dominate your thinking, and you will be less likely to act in an automatic way. Okay. It may also be a motive for affiliation. If you know the group you're in has a different attitude than you, that might motivate you to change your attitude or move in the direction of your peers. It may be that the norms of the situation are politically correct, right? And it's not moral or normative to show any bias. Okay, and so again, when you are willing, okay, that is you have the right motives, and you are able, okay, that is you have the time and opportunity to think out your attitudes, the automatic impulsive attitudes will weaken, they'll be less predictive of behavior, and these thoughtful, deliberative attitudes will be more predictive. Okay, so again, if you have the right motives, enough time, right, the willingness and ableness to do it, your planned out or reasoned attitudes will be expressed, okay, in your behavior. So again, what does that mode model stand for? Remember, motivation and opportunity determinants. Okay, determinants. Okay, in other words, willingness and ableness. Okay, do you have both the right motives to think, okay, deliberate more about your attitudes, and do you have the time to do it? Okay, are you not under pressure? Because if you are, right, if you don't have enough time to think things out, you're more likely to rely on your automatic, spontaneous, impulsive attitudes. Okay. So how are these different attitudes measured? Well, as we just explained, right, Likert scales, semantic differentials, feeling thermometers are used for explicit attitudes, right? These kinds of scales measures questionnaires that are very obvious, transparent as to what's being measured, right? And then implicit attitudes, right? We talked in the last section about priming. Russ Fazio uses the priming technique to show, for example, with racial attitudes for automatic bias on race. He presents participants with photos of black or white men. They don't realize it because they think it's for a memory test. But between these photos, he also shows them positive or negative words. And even though they don't realize that the two things are connected, Russ Fazio is measuring how fast you are at responding to good or bad words following either photos of white men's faces or black men's faces. If you have a more positive automatic association with white males, then you will probably be faster at identifying positive words as good, negative words as bad, or I'm sorry, positive words as good for following white males' faces, and slower at identifying negative words as bad. Why is that? Because remember how priming works. If the things are closely associated in your mind, the activation of one concept will just spread, okay, to the closest locations. And if you have a chronic, automatic, impulsive, spontaneous tendency, right, to see something as bad, then you will just easily, okay, be able to think about bad things and respond to bad words quickly. And the reverse is true. If you have a chronic, automatic tendency to think of some object as good, you'll be faster at responding to positive terms. And so Russ Fazio uses this to estimate participants' automatic racial bias, right? If it's more positive or negative towards white males or positive or negative towards black males, right? And you also took the implicit association test. It's a similar kind of test where sometimes you must categorize good words and maybe white male faces and bad words and black male faces, and then it switches it up, right? So sometimes you're categorizing white male faces with bad words and the same key to categorize black male faces with good words. It reveals, right, depending on your speed, right? If you're faster at categorizing black and good, that means you probably have a very positive attitude towards black men. But on the other hand, if you're faster at categorizing items that are white male faces and good words, probably indicates more of a positive attitude towards white men. Okay, and so people can't control these responses, or sometimes they're not aware of what you're even measuring. And so this is the way in which implicit or automatic attitudes are measured, right? Under time pressure or without your awareness. Okay, that's why they're called implicit, because it's a little more covert. It's not as obvious or transparent as to what you are measuring. Okay, so those are different ways in which you measure implicit and explicit attitudes, and they predict different kinds of behavior. Behavior that is very in the moment, right? Split-second behavior, much more predicted by implicit attitudes. Behavior you can't control, like nonverbal expressions, how far you lean towards someone or away from someone when you're sitting down, not something you're usually aware of. Those kinds of behaviors are predicted by implicit attitudes. statements, language, verbal statements more predicted by explicit attitudes, because usually, I mean, sometimes you put your foot in your mouth, right? We have that statement about spontaneous words, but often people are selective and thoughtful about their words, and usually that reflects explicit attitudes. All right, so let's talk about attitude change, right, by using persuasion. Okay, so persuasive communication can be speech, television. Back in the day, it would be radio. These days, it might also be different kinds of internet interactions. Uh, whether we're talking about message boards, Twitter, all those sorts of things. Um, those are all different kinds of persuasive communications, right? People making statements in order to advocating a position, right? In order to get other people to agree with them. Okay. And so the main question in this area of attitude research has been, how should you construct a message so that you change attitudes, right? That's the main goal of this kind of research. And the first model broke up the different variables, okay, in a persuasive communication into the messenger, right, who is delivering the message, right? And some of those variables include that person's credibility, right? If a medical doctor is giving advice on physical exercise and the impact that makes on your cardiovascular system and your general health, that opinion would be trusted, right? Because he's seen as having expertise in the area of health, because he has a medical degree, he has high credibility. Okay? But maybe someone is a movie actor, right? Maybe they're very popular and well known, but they may not be seen as credible giving the same message because they don't have a medical degree and they're not perceived as having actual expertise on the topic that they are advocating for, right? But maybe they talk about something else. Maybe they're advocating for policies that increase equity for female actresses, or maybe increase the pay of production staff on movies, because it's a low paid position, but very important, right? Movies couldn't happen without production staff. In that case, right, because the actor or actress's expertise is in film, we would think that those positions are advocating that match up with their expertise are more credible. Okay, so it depends, right? Credibility depends on what the person is saying and their background. Okay, attractiveness is also a factor. We're more likely to pay attention to messengers that are attractive as opposed to unattractive. Okay, and that's a human tendency that we've talked about before, right? Favoring attractiveness, believing attractive people more, believing that they're just wonderful in general, right? Status. Usually, if there's a homeless person, talking on the street corner about a political position or a social issue, probably going to get ignored, right? But if it's a senator or a professor on television, more likely to be watched, right? More likely to be listened to. Okay, so those are different variables that have to do with the messenger influencing how likely you are to listen. Okay, listen and believe their message. Okay. There's also the kind of message that you are delivering. Okay, so for example, when you provide an example, a vivid example, like let's say you're advocating gun safety and you talk about children that you have seen who were dead, right? And you describe in vivid detail the way their bodies look, their bullet-ridden bodies, right? You use very emotional or what we call evocative language, right? That elicits people's strong feelings, memories, sensory experiences, right? Because you're guiding their imagination to seeing these dreadful images. That has more of an impact than, say, statistics, right? You could say 5,000 children are killed every year. It's very abstract. I can't imagine 5,000 kids in my head, so it's not as vivid. And so it's not as persuasive. Okay, it's persuasive if you are approaching the message, by thinking about base rates, right? What we've talked to you about judgment and decision making before, right? Knowing the base rates, probably going to make a better decision, but not everyone does that, right? Sometimes they rely on very vivid or familiar examples, right, in order to be persuaded or to believe something. And so that often has greater persuadability. Okay. Messages that are two-sided, okay, where you attack your opponent and then provide your own message, are usually stronger. Okay, why is that? Well, because you might be getting messages from Pepsi and Coca-Cola, and it's going to lead to confusion, right? Because you're getting good messages, good information about Pepsi, Cola, good information about Coca-Cola. And so, neither one of those companies has a real leverage or advantage in terms of which direction you're going to go into. But if I present to you a commercial ad, right, where I'm attacking Pepsi, and then I show you how great Coke is, that's going to be more persuasive, because now when you think about Pepsi, you're going to think, oh, I feel negative about them, but I only feel positive about Coca-Cola. That's going to lead you to move in the direction of Coca-Cola because I've tainted my opponent, right? So two-sided, what we call two-sided messages where you attack your opponent and promote yourself, are usually stronger in terms of impacting actual behavior. Okay. And also fear is another strong motivator. Okay. When you tell people that they're threatened, that they should be scared of, let's say, infectious diseases, so you better get your children vaccinated, or you need to be afraid of oral disease, right, by having good oral hygiene, brushing your teeth, make you afraid of cavities. Fear often activates a need. Okay, we need safety. Okay, and by activating fear and then providing a product or idea that makes you feel safe, right, then you're more attracted to it, right? You actually think you need the object, you may not, right? Because we just put you in a fearful, threatened state where you wanted safety immediately, and then we provided it, right, in the form of an object, attitude, idea. Those are also that's a very persuasive approach for convincing someone about the merits, okay, how good your product or idea is. Okay. The audience also has an impact on the persuadability of a message. Okay, if they're interested in the product or have a lot of knowledge about it, that makes it easier to persuade, what we call preaching to the choir, right? You're working with an audience that you already know will probably be convinced by your ideas, right? Personality can also affect persuadability. People with low self-esteem, they are actually more critical and skeptical of arguments. Why is that? Well, because they're so skeptical of themselves. Okay, that's why they have low self-esteem, not a lot of confidence. They don't have a lot of confidence in other ideas or objects either, and so they give more scrutiny. Okay, they're more skeptical. They process information more. And so often for someone with low self-esteem, the message has to be geared with lots of facts and figures to convince them. Person with high self-esteem doesn't process things as well because they're in a generally happy state. And so you can use positive associations, positive imagery with the person that has high self-esteem, and they're likely to be convinced. Okay, as long as there's positive associations with your idea, or object, they're more likely to be persuaded by it. Okay, pre-existing attitudes, it's similar to knowledge and interests, right? If you're preaching to the choir, they'll be convinced, easily persuaded by your ideas. And then motivation. Okay, we'll talk about that one a little more, but motivation is also a big factor. Okay, if you're motivated to process my message, you'll probably look at every aspect of it, right? All the details, facts. You'll think about it, several times. But if you're not too motivated, right, I might be able to use what we call heuristics, right? Vivid examples. Maybe the first thing I do is really impressive and you don't pay attention to anything else after that, right? We have, what we call the anchoring and adjustment effect, where we do tend to use information at the beginning more so, right? If we're not motivated to pay attention to what's going on, to process every single aspect of the message thoroughly, then we can easily be convinced by heuristics. And this brings me to what is today the more popular model of attitude change. Okay, it's called the elaboration likelihood model. Okay, what elaboration means is how much thought, how much deliberative thought, elaborating of thought. Elaboration means how much more explanation, how much more description you give to something. Okay, so elaboration means a lot of thinking about the attitude object. Okay, so this model basically is focused on predicting. Okay, what is the likelihood that you're going to think a lot about a persuasive message, about an attitude object, and when are you likely to not think, not elaborate too much on the attitude object or the persuasive message. Okay, and so when you are able, okay, and you're motivated, okay, here's that willingness and ableness principle again. Okay, when the message is important or interesting, you're obviously going to be more motivated, right? So you see that lower box in the left-hand corner there, right? The message is important or interesting. You're going to do more elaboration. And the elaboration likelihood model says you will then use the central route of processing, or the central route of elaboration, which is also called systematic processing. Okay, and here you're less likely to rely on heuristics. For example, how vivid and emotional the persuasive message is, less likely to focus on that and more likely to focus on how strong the arguments are. Systematic processing means you're going to look at all aspects of the persuasive message. You're going to think about them several times before you come to a conclusion, okay, about how persuaded you were by this message. Okay, on the other hand, if you're not interested in the message, right, it's about some kind of drink that you never use, or you are in the moment and you're not able to think about the message clearly because you're having another conversation with someone. In those cases, right, when motivation is low, when you're not able to process everything, you'll use heuristics, right? Because you have to quickly come up with a conclusion. You don't have time to look for base rates or to look at all the information thoroughly several times, and so you need to make a quick decision. You'll use heuristics. Okay, and this could be several things. It could be the attractiveness of the messenger. Okay, maybe that's all you can process right now. Maybe it's how positive the message is. The message is positive, maybe it's all inaccurate, but it sounded like a positive message, so it's probably a good message, right? Or maybe it was a long message. Okay, maybe it was, again, all inaccurate, right? No good facts, and if you listened to it, you would have been able to figure that out, right? But the message is all positive, and so it gives you a positive feeling, right? That's the heuristic, the rule of thumb you're using. I have a positive feeling, therefore the message is positive, right? Or if it's a long message, it must have had a lot of information. And if something has a lot of information, maybe it's a good message, right? So heuristics are often quick assessments. It's not looking at all the different factors in the message, right? Sometimes it's only one thing, one feature that you focused on, right? Attractiveness of the messenger, length of the message, positivity of the message, how memorable the message was, how vivid it was, how emotional, right? All those things, usually one feature, if you're using heuristic processing, is what led you to your conclusion about the message. Okay, so again, the central route, it happens when you're really motivated, interested in the message, able to really process it thoroughly, and that leads to systematic processing, where you only look at how strong the arguments are. But if you're not processing things that well, you're not motivated, more likely to use a heuristic. So again, how does this work? Well, if you're motivated, right, the issue is important to you, you have a lot of knowledge about it, okay, you feel responsible in some personal way for the idea, okay, you're going to use the central route or systematic processing. That usually means you're only going to be convinced by how strong the arguments are, what we call argument quality. Okay, but remember, if you're not motivated, okay, you're not able to, right? You're distracted, you don't care, right? Maybe the message is too complicated, right? It's such complicated policy issue that you're not able to process everything that well, right? You're more likely to focus on what social psychologists call the peripheral aspects of the message, right? You're more likely to use a heuristic, quick rule of thumb to make your conclusion, right? And it might be the attractiveness of the source, how famous the person is, how many arguments they gave, right? How other people feel about the argument, right? What's the perceived consensus, right? How many people agree with this topic? Okay. So again, here's another um, diagram, okay, again showing that when able to, right, when you have an audience that's very analytical, motivated, they will elaborate, and they will only be convinced by strong arguments, right? Those who go the peripheral route, not very analytical, right? Not processing everything, not interested, right? More likely to use peripheral cues or heuristics, and that's what leads to them liking the persuasive message and the attitude object. So here is an example of that. Okay, what you see here is that these researchers, okay, they try to manipulate attitudes towards a comprehensive exam. Okay, a comprehensive exam is a type of exam that colleges and universities used to think about administering. In addition to your GPA, you would also, a certain GPA, grade point average, you would also need to get a certain score on a comprehensive exam for your discipline, your senior year of college, and that would determine whether or not you get your degree besides the GPA requirement. Okay, so not something that's done that often today, but at the time it was an idea being discussed, and they used this as a way to see if they could change people's attitudes using the peripheral route or the central route. Okay, so first of all, you see in red there, sometimes they made the comprehensive exam that they were providing a persuasive message for. They made the comprehensive exam something that would be happening at the participants, at the student's own university. Okay, in this case, it was Ohio State University, or at some other university. Okay, so the idea is that if it's happening at your university, you're going to be more motivated to read the persuasive message and to analyze it more thoroughly. Okay, whereas if it's at some other university, you're not going to care as much. You're not going to put in as much effort to analyze the message. Okay. And so again, in red there is when it was at your own university that you're reading a persuasive message for comprehensive exams. In green, it was at another university. Okay. And what you can see, okay, is that when the arguments are strong, okay, the arguments are strong, it's more likely to affect the people who are at that university. Okay, so you know it's going to impact you. Oh no, Ohio State, my university is going to implement comprehensive exams. That's going to impact me. I'll have to do that exam. So you thoroughly read the message, and if the arguments are good, well, it actually turns out that you're very convinced, okay, that comprehensive exams are a good idea. But if the arguments are weak, that you read through, it's the opposite direction. Okay, you see it, you have a very negative attitude towards comprehensive exams. So it's all about argument quality. When the person is really motivated and able to read the persuasive message, it is the actual facts, arguments that are made that are what is convincing. Okay, if they're good, then you will probably have a more positive attitude. If they're bad arguments, more likely to have a negative attitude. So that's what you see in that left-hand panel with the red. Okay. On the other hand, you see in the green, when it was some other university, okay, some other university that you were reading about, right? People didn't read the arguments thoroughly. It doesn't matter if they were strong or weak. You can see that they stayed in the neutral point because they didn't really care. Okay, they didn't care. They didn't process any of the arguments. They stayed near an indifferent neutral point. Okay. Now we go over here to the right-hand panel. Okay, very similar setup, but in this case, okay, it's not the arguments that we're looking at. It is whether you were told that the source was an expert source or a non-expert source. Okay, so in this case, the expert source was a college professor. The non-expert source was a college student. Okay, the idea that a college professor is assumed to have more knowledge, more credibility when it comes to making arguments about what a university should or should not do in terms of education policy. Okay, whereas a college student is thought to be young, not have very much knowledge or expertise. Okay, and so what you see here, right, is that when it is important to the person, right, the comprehensive exams are going to happen at your university. They're going to impact you personally. The source of the arguments is not relevant to them, right? They're more convinced by argument quality, not necessarily about the source, right? But on the other hand, when it was at some other university, these comprehensive exams, you'll probably never even have to take the exam, right? We know argument quality didn't affect them, right? Because they didn't read the messages, but what they did read, right, at the beginning of the paragraph is where the information came from. Did it come from a college professor or did it come from a college student? And now you see this is where the effects happen. When you're not at that school, when you did not read the message thoroughly, when you use just the first thing you heard in the paragraph, if you saw a college professor, you're more likely to think, oh, this must be a good persuasive message, right? You see they go in the positive direction in that green bar for expert source. But when it is a college student, that's the first thing they see. They don't read anything else in the paragraph. More likely to have a negative attitude just because it's a college student. Okay, so again, when you don't care about a message, you're not motivated to process it, more likely to use these quick rules of thumb, these heuristics, less likely to systematically, thoroughly, deliberately process the information. And it leads to totally different outcomes, okay, in terms of your attitudes. All right, so again, what are the factors that influence whether or not you'll process or not process a message? Okay, well, you're more likely to use systematic processing when you're strongly motivated, right? When you want to be accurate, maybe you want to present a certain impression to someone, your boss, your colleague, right? Or it could also be defensiveness. Okay, if your group is competing with another group, like let's say it's a football game or a war or some other type of competitive situation, okay, when you get questioned, your group gets questioned, you're more likely to process all the information, okay, partly because you're trying to find a way to explain or rationalize, okay, what your group did. Okay, but that's another time where you will systematically process all the information. Okay, also people who are high in need for cognition, people who like to do a lot of thinking, in general, they will devote more thought to a persuasive message, do more systematic processing, take the central route of processing for that message. And of course, when you use heuristic processing or the peripheral route, it's because likely you're unmotivated or you just don't have the ability to systematically process all of that information. All right. So the last topic, okay, this is one of the more popular topics in social psychology, so I kind of saved the best for last. Okay, but we're going to talk about cognitive dissonance theory. Okay, when it comes to attitudes, this is usually a theory that suggests methods where behavior comes first. People either make a choice or you have them engage in a task that's boring or it's traumatic, and then they have to justify it later. Okay, so in this case, behavior change comes first, and then it leads to attitude change after the fact. Okay, often because you can't change behavior, right? You can't go back in time, but you can change your attitudes about a behavior. Okay, so keep that in mind as we talk about cognitive dissonance. Okay, so what is cognitive dissonance? Basically, it's inconsistencies. Okay, when you have inconsistencies between your thoughts, sentiments, actions, it creates a negative, anxious, emotional state. Okay, that Leon Festinger back in the 50s called dissonance. And it prompts you, it motivates you to try and restore consistency. Okay, because consistency feels good and balanced. Inconsistency, this dissonance, it feels anxious and negative. Okay? And these inconsistencies, these feeling of anxiety about inconsistency, it can occur in three main ways. Okay, one is when you have to choose between two alternatives that are very attractive, very similar. It's very difficult to choose between them. Okay. Also, when you feel you've wasted effort, okay, when you're like, why did I do that? Okay, you have to try and explain it, justify it. Okay, and also when you do behaviors that are contrary, the opposite of what you said in the past, the opposite of your attitudes, that's a big inconsistency, obviously creates lots of dissonance, and then the person must find a way to resolve that dissonance. Right, so let's talk about making hard choices. Okay, so one of the ways this has been studied the most is making a hard choice after a purchase. Okay, so you can think about two items that are very similar in attractiveness. Nothing is special, nothing stands out about either item, but you have to make a choice, right? You can't have both items. Okay, well, sometimes you might feel like, well, did I pick the right thing? I did it so quickly, I don't know. Okay, that feeling is dissonance, right? That uncertainty you have about the choice you made, right? Or maybe you start thinking about what good qualities the item you didn't choose might have. Okay, that's dissonance. Okay, we call that post-decision dissonance, right? It means that it's the possibility, right? You're feeling anxiety about the possibility of being wrong. Okay, and so what people end up doing is changing their perceptions of what they rejected, right? The item they didn't choose and the item they did choose. Okay, so how does that happen? Okay, well, Jack Brem did the first study on post-decision dissonance. It's a very simple study. Okay, what he did was he asked participants to rate a bunch of consumer products. Participants were offered a choice between two items. Either the items were very close in attractiveness, which would probably produce a lot of dissonance. In other cases, the items were so apart in attractiveness that probably shouldn't produce any dissonance, right? Because it was it was easier, right, to make those choices than the harder choices where the items are very similar. Right? So after making all those choices, Jack Brem then has participants rate all the products, the ones they rejected, the ones they accepted, again in 20 minutes later. Okay, what you can see right there on the right hand corner, okay, is that the experimental group, okay, that is the group that had to choose between um, very similarly attractive items, that for the item they chose, they end up increasing. Okay, they end up increasing how much they like the item. You can see by 40% increase there, right? That's that blue bar all the way to the left. There is an increase in how much they like the item they chose between the two. Okay, whereas the item they didn't choose, it's the opposite. Okay, you see that blue bar on the right? It goes in the other direction, 40% decrease in how much they dislike the item that they rejected. So again, right, the items are so similar, it's easy to think about what you missed out on. And so in order to justify, bolster the decision they already made that they can't change, right, they basically inflate the thing they chose and deflate the item that they rejected, right? Makes them more comfortable, makes them feel more consistent with the decision they already made that they cannot change. Okay. You see with the control group, right, where it was very easy to choose one item over the other, there's not much of a difference. Okay, they feel indifferent towards the item they didn't choose, right? They didn't choose it. They're not thinking about it. The item they did choose, they thought it was good, but they're not spending a lot of time thinking about it either because it was an easy decision. Don't have to think about it anymore. Okay, hard decision, you have to think about it more. That's why there's more dissonance. That's why there's more rationalization. That's why there's more attitude change in opposite directions, right? Denigrating the thing you rejected, promoting, inflating the object that you chose. Okay. This isn't just done with uh, consumer items, right? You can think about cognitive dissonance after any kind of choice, right? Not just a purchase. So imagining someone selecting between two equally attractive mates, right? You can't choose both, right? It's not how our society works. So you have to make a choice. And then what may you end up doing? Well, you might end up, just like a purchase, demonizing, right, the partner you reject, right? Because you don't want to question or think about what you could have had, right? You want to be certain, you want to feel good that you made the best choice, the right choice. And so you promote the partner you choose, right? At least at the beginning of the relationship, right? When you have the so-called honeymoon period, right? So it can happen with any kind of difficult choice. People will often do more rationalization, more justification over a hard choice than an easy choice. Okay, so that's one kind of way dissonance can develop. Another way is through what's called effort justification. Okay, if you feel you've wasted time for something that turned out to be disappointing, then you have to try and save face, right? Explain to yourself, well, why did I do all that? Okay, and that's going to produce dissonance, and then you'll have to figure out some way to resolve the dissonance, to restore yourself to feeling balanced and consistent with yourself. Okay, so Aronson and Mills first designed one of the first experiments to test this kind of dissonance, which is called the initiation experiment. And you'll see it's very similar to initiation rituals used by other organizations, okay, like fraternities, the military, other organizations, cults. Okay, organizations tend to use these sorts of initiations because it leads to greater commitment, greater loyalty to the group. Okay, so let's look at what Aronson and Mills did in the experiment. Okay, well, first they recruited women to participate in a discussion about sex, which at this time is a very uncomfortable topic for women. It is the 50s after all. Okay, and they're put into three kinds of conditions, which Aronson and Mills called mild initiation, severe initiation, and a control group. Basically, in the initiation conditions, participants were told that they had to pass a test to then be in the discussion group later. In the mild initiation, these women just read a list of mild words and a romantic passage from a novel to an experimenter. In the severe initiation phase, right, which was supposed to be the most humiliating, okay, women had to read a list of explicit words and a pornographic passage to the experimenter. So it should be much more humiliating for a single woman, single young woman of the 50s, right, to have to read that kind of material as opposed to the more vanilla, right, romance novel. Okay. So then afterwards, all people were told they passed the test, but that the discussion had already started. So they listened to a taped discussion. They didn't realize it was taped, of course. Social psychologists have this tendency, right, to deceive their participants. But they thought it was a live discussion. They listened over the headphones, and then they rated the discussion. Okay, how much did you like the discussion on sex? Okay, so what do you think? Okay, so this is one of your next activities. Okay, go ahead and take out, again, a piece of paper, your full name, and write down, what do you think? Do you think women who were just in the mild initiation, they just read a romantic passage, mild words, do you think they liked the discussion about sex the most out of the three groups? You think it was the women in the severe initiation, right? They read explicit words, pornographic material. Do you think they liked the discussion the most? Or do you think it was the control group? Okay, remember the control group? They were told that they passed the test, right? But the test doesn't involve any kind of initiation. Okay, and then they listen on to the discussion as well. So which of those three groups? Okay, the mild initiation, severe initiation, or control group? Which of those liked hearing about the discussion about sex most? Or maybe your answer is none. Okay, maybe none of them liked the discussion at all. So go ahead and write your response. Okay, and why you think, just one statement about why you think that group would like, or maybe none of the groups, okay, would like the discussion over listening the discussion about sex. Okay. All right, so keep that in mind as you look at the results here. Okay, so what you can see there is that you see on the left hand axis, right on the y-axis, you see higher numbers mean more liking, okay, more liking of the discussion. And you can see for the control group and the mild initiation group, right? They didn't do, control group did no reading to an experimenter. Mild initiation did the romantic reading. They didn't have much difference in opinion about how much they liked the discussion. But when you look at the severe initiation, right, where the women had to do the more humiliating task, right, of reading pornography to the experimenter, explicit words, reading off explicit words, they end up claiming to like the discussion more. Okay, what explains this? Well, Aronson and Mills claim that because you did such a humiliating thing, it was so much more effort, right, on your part, and you think to yourself, well, why did I do this? Because now I'm just over listening, to this discussion. I'm not even participating in it. They say they like it more because they have to justify, rationalize why they just did all that stuff, right? Reading off this humiliating material to the experimenter. Okay, so again, wasted effort, having to justify why you did something can also lead to liking, right? Liking the group that you did this humiliating stuff for. The third way in which dissonance can happen is what's called induced compliance. Okay, this is where you get someone to do something that's inconsistent with their beliefs, attitudes, or values, right? Which obviously leads to dissonance because you're not acting according to what you say or believe in, right? And this can lead to a change in attitudes, right? Because you can't change your behavior, so maybe you actually liked what you did. Maybe you actually liked the object. Okay. So Festinger and Carl Smith, Leon Festinger and Merrill Carl Smith are the first social psychologists to do a forced compliance experiment. Okay. And so what they did was they asked participants to turn square pegs. Other versions have other boring tasks where participants might highlight the letter I every time they see it in a textbook. Okay. And then later on, participants are told, oh, my research assistant isn't here, they're late. Can you stand in for them? Can you convince the next person coming in for the experiment to do it? And this is the independent variable. Participants were only compensated $1 or $20, okay, for doing the experiment and convincing the next person to do it as well. Okay, and then the dependent variable, right, the attitude that we're measuring is asking the participants, how much did you like doing this experiment? Okay, so this is our last activity. Go ahead and take out another piece of paper and think about this. Okay, you did a boring experiment where you're highlighting the letter I in a textbook, or you're just turning square pegs. I mean, really boring, right? Why are you doing this? Okay, and now you're told, oh, you get $1. Please convince this next person. Or, right, you're told, here's $20, right? Now convince the next person to do this experiment. Okay, now think about it. In which condition, which situation are you more likely to say that you like the experiment? Or maybe you think neither one of them would like it. So go ahead and write down your response, and then write down quickly a statement as to why you believe it's the $1 group or the $20 group or neither group, okay, that would like the experiment most. Okay, so keep that in mind as we look at the results on the next two slides. Okay, this next slide, we're just going to review the organization of the experiment. Okay, we have all the wonderful participants coming in. They're doing boring tasks. And they are asked how much they enjoy the experiment, right? That's the dependent variable, the attitude we're measuring. Remember, on sometimes for doing that boring task, half the time the participants were paid $20. Okay, and then they had to tell the next person the task was fun and interesting, and then asked how much they enjoyed it. Right? Or sometimes they were paid $1 and then had to tell the next person how much they enjoyed it and to please also participate in the experiment. Okay, so now let's get the results. Okay, so they got asked 4 questions at the end of the experiment. How enjoyable were the tasks? Right, so you see that in the control group and the group that got $20, negative. Okay, this was boring. I wasn't interested in this. Right? So might be surprising for some people because some people think, oh, you pay someone $20, that means that they'll enjoy what they're doing. Okay, but that's not necessarily the case. Remember extrinsic motivation. Remember, you can kill someone's motivation to do something if you start paying them money, right? Giving them extrinsic motivation. Okay, so even though a behaviorist, right, someone who believes in positive reinforcement would think that rewards always increase motivation, we know that's often not the case. Okay, and in this case, that's true. Okay, $20 was not sufficient justification for the boring stuff you did, right? In fact, it probably made you think, oh, I just did it for the $20. I don't have any real interest in this boring thing I did, right? But you look at the control group and you realize, well, there's no intrinsic motivation either, because when you're not paid anything at all, right, you still hate the task. In fact, they hate the task more than anyone else does, right, because they weren't given anything at all. Okay, so they have a negative 45 rating for doing this experiment. Now you look at the people who got paid $1. They have a very positive view of this experiment. How can that be? Right? They got only paid $1. That's nothing. Okay, well, that's the problem, is if you got paid $1 and you know this is nothing, then why did you do all that boring stuff? You turned pegs for an hour, or in some cases highlighted the letter I in a textbook. That's really boring, right? You can't tell people I did it for $1 because that doesn't make any sense. And so in this case, right, you can't just say, oh, it was boring, right, because you did it for this $1, and that doesn't make sense either. And so a better explanation is that I guess I liked it. I guess it wasn't that boring. It was actually kind of enjoyable in some ways. Okay, so that's the attitude change you're getting here. Okay, you see about how much they learned. Not much difference there. Okay. Scientific importance, you see that the $1 condition assigns it more importance than the control or $20 condition. And then whether or not they would participate in the experiment again, you see that the $1 condition reports they would definitely do the experiment again. The control and $20 conditions say, oh no, that was so boring, I would never ever want to do that ever again. Okay, so this is one way, right? Carl Smith and Fessinger, because they got people to do something boring, couldn't justify it, right? They then have to come up with an explanation for why they did it. It must be that what they did was actually kind of enjoyable and they would be willing to do it again. So here you see those ratings again, right? That first question they get asked and the $1 condition is way more positive than the control condition or the $20 condition. So what is cognitive dissonance? Again, it's the unpleasant feelings, right? The anxiety you feel when your behavior is in conflict with your beliefs. We feel inconsistent. It makes us more self-conscious. We think, what's wrong with me? Why did I do that? That was boring, or that was humiliating, or the choices were too similar. I don't know. I don't know if I made the right choice, right? If you're doing that kind of thinking about something you just did, that is the cognitive dissonance. Okay. So often it's about not looking like a chump or stupid, right? It's trying to save face, right? When we did something for almost nothing or something embarrassing, something boring, right? And then technique is often used by cults, the military, fraternities, and other organizations because it is a way to create loyalty and commitment to the group, right? The people do these humiliating things. They have to justify it to themselves, right? They can't go back in time. They can't change the behaviors, but they can change their perception. They can change their evaluation, their attitude about what they did and about the group, right, that they did it for. Often it leads to more positive attitudes. And again, all these cognitive dissonance experiments disprove behaviorism, right? Especially Festinger and Carl Smith's forced compliance experiment, because the highest reward was not the group with the most positive attitude, right? It was the group that had to justify why they did this boring stuff. That is the group, right? The group with dissonance that had the most positive attitude, right? Because they had the most to prove, right? People got paid $20. They can just say, well, I did this boring stuff for $20. I don't have to make it look good, right? And $20 is a lot of money at that time, 1959. So it's sufficient justification. It's a good enough explanation. Okay, but doing boring stuff for an hour for $1 is not a good explanation. Okay. So remember the logic of an initiation ritual, right? Or any other coerced behaviors. The reason that this type of technique works is because you can't go back in time and change your behavior, okay? But you can change your thoughts about it, okay? And that's what you see here with this Dilbert cartoon. I'll let you go ahead and take some time to read that, but it really explains, post-decision or forced compliance cognitive dissonance really well. Okay, a lot of people understand this psychological process that we sometimes go through. Okay, so when does inconsistency produce dissonance? Well, it often happens when we think we made a free choice, right? When the choice is hard, that's going to produce dissonance. When we can't explain why we did something, why did I do this humiliating stuff just to listen in on the discussion and miss out on it? Why did I waste all my time turning square pegs or highlighting the letter I, right? I have to explain myself. I have to rationalize why I did that, right? Or if there's a bad outcome to a decision, right? We think, oh, why did we do that? It leads to what's called counterfactual thinking, right? We go back thinking about the event. Maybe if it had been this way, it wouldn't have turned out so bad. And so instead of doing counterfactual thinking, right, we instead try to justify the choice we made, right? Maybe it did turn out bad, but I had no control over it. Okay, maybe it did turn out bad, but it had this unforeseen good consequence, and that's why ultimately it was a good decision, right? There's all sorts of mental gymnastics that we can do to make ourselves feel better about a previous choice, right? A previous behavior. How do you reduce dissonance? Okay, well, you can change your attitude, right? If you started a diet and you kept failing, you can just say, well, the diet's not worth it. Diets don't even work, right? So instead of changing your behavior, right, because you failed so many times, right, it's easier to just change your attitude about the behavior, your attitude towards dieting, right? To say it doesn't work. It's, I should stop even trying. Okay. Or you could add more information, right? You might find out that, there's many overweight people, right? They don't diet, they don't exercise, and they've lived long lives. So why should I keep dieting, right? I have this other information suggests that it's not, it doesn't necessarily do anything beneficial, right? I can still be great and live a long life without, dieting, because I see all these other people doing it. Okay. You could also think that maybe looking thin is not important. Okay, so the initial goal that you had, looking thin or being healthy, right? Not that important, right? Maybe it's better to live a pleasurable life, hedonistic life, eating whatever you want, doing whatever you want, and not being concerned about health, right? Maybe that's not actually valuable, right? That's what we call trivializing or minimizing the the goal. Or you could use what are called indirect methods. Okay, focus on another part of yourself. Okay, I like the way I look, or I'm really smart, or I'm really talented, or I do all these other things. I don't have to be focused on appearance or health. Okay, or you could use distraction, right? When you feel the dissonance, just like if you felt sad or any other negative emotion, you can cope with it by withdrawal or by watching TV, right? Or the use of substances, right? All of these are positive and negative distractions, but they're a way to avoid the dissonance. Okay, so there's direct ways, right? Usually that means changing an attitude, or indirect ways are really about avoiding the dissonance, avoiding the attitude by focusing on something else about yourself or distracting yourself with something else in the environment. Okay, so that concludes the lecture on attitudes, covering everything right from the definitions of those attitudes to the functions, measurement, how do they change using persuasive communication, right? And also how they can be changed by our own behaviors, right? Inducing dissonance and leading us to then change our attitudes. Okay, so that concludes the course, and that finishes up the lectures on social psychology.